Chapter 1. The Hunting Ground. It was a dark, blustery afternoon in spring, and the city of London was chasing a small mining town across the dried-out bed of the old North Sea. In happier times, London would never have bothered with such feeble prey. The great traction city had once spent its days hunting far bigger towns than this, ranging north as far as the edges of the ice waste, and south to the shores of the Mediterranean. But lately, prey of any kind had started to grow scarce, and some of the larger cities had begun to look hungrily at London. For 10 years now it had been hiding from them, skulking in a damp, mountainous western district, which the Guild of Historians said had once been the island of Britain. For 10 years it had eaten nothing but tiny farming towns and static settlements in those wet hills. Now, at last, the Lord Mayor had decided that the time was right to take his city back over the land bridge into the great hunting ground. It was barely halfway across when the lookouts on the high watchtowers spied the mining town, gnawing at the salt flats 20 miles ahead. To the people of London, it seemed like a sign from the gods, and even the Lord Mayor, who didn't believe in gods or signs, thought it was a good beginning to the journey east, and issued the order to give chase. The mining town saw the danger and turned tail, but already the huge caterpillar tracks under London were starting to roll faster and faster. Soon the city was lumbering in pursuit, a moving mountain of metal which rose in 7 tiers like the layers of a wedding cake. The lower levels wreathed in engine smoke, the villas of the rich gleaming white on the higher decks, and above it all, the cross on top of St. Paul's Cathedral glinting gold, 2,000 feet above the ruined earth. Tom was cleaning the exhibits in the London Museum's Natural History section when it started. He felt the telltale tremor in the metal floor. And looked up to find the model whales and dolphins that hung from the gallery roof, swinging on their cables with soft creaking sounds. He wasn't alarmed. He had lived in London for all of his 15 years and was used to its movements. He knew that the city was changing course and putting on speed. A prickle of excitement ran through him, the ancient thrill of the hunt that all Londoners shared. There must be prey in sight. Dropping his brushes and dusters, he pressed his hand to the wall, sensing the vibrations that came rippling up from the huge engine rooms down in the gut. Yes, there it was, the deep throb of the auxiliary motors cutting in, like a big drum beating inside his bones. The door at the far end of the gallery slammed open, and Chudley Pomeroy came storming in, his toupee askew and his round face red with indignation. "What in the name of Quirk?" he blustered, gawping at the gyrating whales and the stuffed birds jiggling and twitching in their cases, as if they were shaking off their long captivity and getting ready to take wing again. "Apprentice Natsworthy, what is going on in here?" "It's a chase, sir," said Tom, wondering how the deputy head of the Guild of Historians had managed to live aboard London for so long and still not recognize its heartbeat. "It must be something good," he explained. "They've brought all the auxiliaries online. That hasn't happened for ages. Maybe London's luck has turned." There's a child. "Yes, I am. Good night." "No. It's past your bedtime. Good night." Thank you for the resub, sausage. Where were we up to? Maybe London's luck has turned. Pah! Snorted Pomeroy, wincing as the glass in the display cases started to whine and shiver in sympathy with the beat of its engines. Above his head, the biggest of the models, a thing called a blue whale that had become extinct thousands of years ago, was jerking back and forth on its horses like a plank swing. That may be Natsworthy, he said. I just wish the Guild of Engineers would fit some decent shock absorbers in this building. Some of these specimens are very delicate. It won't do. It won't do at all. He tugged a spotted handkerchief out of the folds of his long black robes and dabbed his face with it. Please, sir, asked Tom, could I run down to the observation platforms and watch the chase, just for half an hour? It's been years since there was a really good one. Pomeroy looked shocked. Certainly not, apprentice. Look at all the dust that this wretched chase is shaking down. All the exhibits will have to be cleaned again and checked for damage. Oh, but that's not fair, cried Tom. I don't know why I went high-pitched for that. I've just dusted this whole gallery. He knew at once that he had made a mistake. Old Chudley Pomeroy wasn't bad, as guildsmen went, but he didn't like being answered back by a mere third-class apprentice. He drew himself up to his full height, which was only slightly more than his full width, and frowned so sternly that his guild mark almost vanished between his bushy eyebrows. Life isn't fair, Natsworthy, he boomed. Any more cheek from you, and you'll be on gut duty as soon as this chase is over. Of all the horrible chores a third-class apprentice had to perform, gut duty was the one Tom hated most. He quickly shut up, staring meekly down at the beautifully buffed toes of the chief curator's boots. You were told to work in this department until 7 o'clock, and you will work until 7 o'clock, Pomeroy went on. Meanwhile, I shall consult the other curators about this dreadful, dreadful shaking. He hurried off, still muttering. Tom watched him go, then picked up his gear and went miserably back to work. Usually, he didn't mind cleaning, especially not in this gallery, with its amiable moth-eaten animals, and the blue whale smiling its big blue smile. If he grew bored, he simply took refuge in a daydream, in which he was a hero who rescued beautiful girls from air pirates, saved London from the Anti-Traction League, and lived happily ever after. But how could he daydream, with the rest of the city enjoying the first proper chase for ages? He waited for 20 minutes. But Chudley Pomeroy did not return. There was nobody else about. It was a Wednesday, which meant the museum was closed to the public, and most of the senior guildsmen and first and second class apprentices would be having the day off. What harm could it do if he slipped outside for 10 minutes, just to see what was happening? He hid his bag of cleaning stuff behind a handy yak and hurried through the shadows of dancing dolphins to the door. Out in the corridor, all the argon lamps were dancing too, spilling their light up the metal walls. 2 black-robed guildsmen hurried past, and Tom heard the reedy voice of old Dr. Arkengarth whine. Vibrations, vibrations. It's playing merry hell with my 25th century ceramics. He waited until they had vanished around a bend in the corridor, then slipped quickly out and down the nearest stairway. He cut through the 21st century gallery, past the big plastic statues of Pluto and Mickey, animal-headed gods of lost America. He ran across the main hall and down galleries full of things that had somehow survived through all the millennia since the ancients destroyed themselves in that terrible flurry of orbit-to-Earth atomics and tailored virus bombs called the 60-Minute War. 2 minutes later, he slipped out through a side entrance into the noise and bustle of the Tottenham Court Road. The London Museum stood at the very hub of Tier 2 in a busy district called Bloomsbury, and the underbelly of Tier 1 hung like a rusty sky a few feet above the rooftops. Tom didn't worry about being spotted as he pushed his way along the dark, crowded street towards the public goggle screen outside the Tottenham Court. Joining the crowd in front of it, he had his first glimpse of the distant prey, a watery blue-grey blur captured by cameras down on Tier 6. "The town is called Salt Hook," boomed the voice of the announcer. "A mining platform of 900 inhabitants. She is currently heading due east, but the Guild of Navigators predicts London will catch her before sundown. There are sure to be many more towns awaiting us beyond the land bridge. Clear proof of just how wise our beloved Lord Mayor was when he decided to bring London east again." Tom had never felt his city move at such an astonishing speed, and he longed to be down at the observation deck, feeling the wind on his face. He was probably already in trouble with Mr. Pomeroy. What difference could it make if he stole a few more minutes? He set off at a run and soon reached Bloomsbury Park, out in the open air on the Tier's brim. It had been a proper park once, with trees and duck ponds, but because of the recent shortage of prey, it had been given over to food production, and its lawns grubbed up to make way for cabbage plots and algae pans. The observation platforms were still there, though, raised balconies jutting out from the edge of the tier where Londoners could go to watch the passing view. Tom hurried towards the nearest. An even bigger crowd had gathered there, including quite a few people in the black of the Historians' Guild, and Tom tried to look inconspicuous as he pushed his way through to the front. Salt Hook was only 5 miles ahead, travelling flat out with black smoke spewing from its exhaust stacks. "Natsworthy," called a braying voice, and his heart sank. He looked round and found that he was standing next to Maleficent, a burly first-class apprentice, who grinned at him and said, "Isn't it wonderful? A fat little salt mining platform with C-20 land engines. Just what London needs." Herbert Maleficent was the worst sort of bully, the sort who didn't just hit you and stick your head down the lavatory, but made it his business to find out all your secrets and the things that upset you most and taunt you with them. He enjoyed picking on Tom, who was small and shy and had no friends to stick up for him, and Tom could not get back at him because Maleficent's family had paid to make him a first-class apprentice, while Tom, who had no family, was a mere third. He knew Maleficent was only bothering to talk to him because he was hoping to impress a pretty young historian named Clytie Potts, who was standing just behind him. Tom nodded and turned his back, concentrating on the chase. "Look!" shouted Clytie Potts. The gap between London and its prey was narrowing fast, and a dark shape had lifted clear of Salt Hook. Soon there was another and another. Airships! The crowds on London's observation platforms cheered, and Maleficent said, "Ah, air merchants. They know the town is doomed, you see, so they are making sure they get away before we eat it. If they don't, we can claim their cargoes along with everything else aboard." Tom was glad to see that Clytie Potts looked thoroughly bored by Maleficent, She was a year above him and must already know this stuff, because she had passed her guild exams and had the historian's mark tattooed on her forehead. "Look," she said again, catching Tom's glance and grinning. "Oh, look at them go. Aren't they beautiful?" Tom pushed his untidy hair out of his eyes and watched as the airships rose up and vanished into the slate grey clouds. For a moment he found himself longing to go with them up into the sunlight. If only his poor parents had not left him to the care of the guild, to be trained as a historian. He wished he could be cabin boy aboard a sky clipper and see all the cities of the world. Puerto Angeles drift on the blue Pacific, and Archangel skating on iron runners across the frozen northern seas, and great ziggurat towns of the Nuevo Mayans and the unmoving strongholds of the Anti-Traction League. But that was just a daydream. Better saved for some dull museum afternoon. A fresh outbreak of cheering warned him that the chase was nearing its end, and he forgot the airships and turned his attention back to Salt Hook. The little town was so close that he could see the ant-like shapes of people running about on its upper tiers. How frightened they must be, with London bearing down on them and nowhere to hide. But he knew he mustn't feel sorry for them. It was natural that cities ate towns, just as the towns ate smaller towns, and smaller towns snapped up the miserable static settlements. That was municipal Darwinism, and it was the way the world had worked for hundreds of years, ever since the great engineer Nicholas Quirk had turned London into the first traction city. "London, London," he shouted, adding his voice to the cheers and shouts of everybody else on the platform. And a moment later they were rewarded by the sight of one of Salt Hook's wheels breaking loose. The town slewed to a halt, smokestacks snapping off and crashing down into the panicked streets. And then London's lower tiers blocked it from view, and Tom felt the deck plates shiver as the city's huge hydraulic jaws came slamming shut. There was frantic cheering from observation platforms all over the city. Loudspeakers on the tier support pillars started to play London Pride, and somebody Tom had never even seen before hugged him tight and shouted in his ear, "A catch!" He didn't mind. At that moment he loved everybody on the platform, even Maleficent. "A catch!" he yelled back, struggling free, and felt the deck plates trembling again. Somewhere below him the city's great steel teeth were gripping Salt Hook, lifting it and dragging it backwards into the gut. "And perhaps Apprentice Natsworthy would like to come as well," Clytie Potts was saying. Tom had no idea what she was talking about, but as he turned, she touched his arm and smiled. "There'll be celebrations in Kensington Gardens tonight," she explained. "Dancing and fireworks. Do you want to come?" Excuse me, I just burped. People didn't usually invite third-class apprentices to parties, especially not people as pretty and popular as Clytie. And Tom wondered at first if she were making fun of him. But Maleficent obviously didn't think so, for he tugged her away and said, "We don't want Natsworthy's sort here." "Why not?" asked the girl. "Well, you know," huffed Maleficent, his square face turning almost red as Pomeroy's. "He's just a third, a skivvy. He'll never get his guild mark. He'll just end up as a curator's assistant. Won't you, Natsworthy?" he asked, leering at Tom. "It's a pity your dad didn't leave you enough money for a proper apprenticeship." "That's none of your business," shouted Tom angrily. His elation at the catch had evaporated, and he was on edge again, wondering what punishments would be in store when Pomeroy found out that he had sneaked away. He was in no mood for Maleficent's taunts. Still, that's what comes of living in a slum on the lower tiers, I suppose, smirked Maleficent, turning back to Clytie Potts. Natsworthy's mum and dad lived down on 4, see? And when the big tilt happened, they both got squashed flat as a couple of raspberry pancakes. Tom didn't mean to hit him. It just happened. Before he knew what he was doing, his hand had curled into a tight fist, and he lashed out. "Ow!" wailed Maleficent, so startled that he fell over backwards. Someone cheered, and Clytie stifled a giggle. Tom just stood staring at his trembling fist, wondering how he had done it. But Maleficent was much bigger and tougher than Tom, and he was already back on his feet. Clytie tried to restrain him, but some other historians were cheering him on, and a group of boys in the green tunics of apprentice navigators clustered close behind and chanted, "Fight, fight, fight." Tom knew he stood no more chance against Maleficent than Salthook had stood against London. He took a step backwards, but the crowd was hemming him in. Then Maleficent's fist hit him on the side of the face, and Maleficent's knee crashed up hard between his legs, and he was bent double and stumbling away with his eyes full of tears. Something as big and softly yielding as a sofa stood in his way, and he rammed his head against it and said, "Oof." He looked up into the round, red, bushy eyebrowed face under an unconvincing wig, a face that grew even redder when it recognized him. "Natsworthy," boomed Chudley Pomeroy, "what in Quirk's name do you think you're playing at?" Chapter 2, Valentine. Hi, Carrie. Hi, sausage. Okay, Chapter 2, Valentine. And so Tom found himself being sent off to do gut duty, while all the other apprentices were busy celebrating the capture of Salthook. After a long, embarrassing lecture in Pomeroy's office, "Disobedience, Natsworthy, striking a senior apprentice, what would your poor parents have thought?" He trudged over to Tottenham Court Road and waited for a down elevator. When it came, it was crowded. The seats in the upper compartment were packed with arrogant-looking men and women from the Guild of Engineers, the most powerful of the 4 great guilds which ran London. They gave Tom the creeps, with their bald heads and those long white rubber coats they wore. So he stayed standing in the lower section, where the stern face of the Lord Mayor stared down at him from posters saying, "Movement is life. Help the Guild of Engineers keep London moving." Down and down went the elevator, stopping at all the familiar stations: Bakerloo, High Holborn, Low Holborn, Bethnal Green. And at every stop, another crowd of people surged into the car, squashing him against the back wall, until it was almost a relief to reach the bottom and step out into the noise and bustle of the gut. The gut was where London dismantled the towns it caught, a stinking sprawl of yards and factories between the jaws and the central engine rooms. Tom loathed it. It was always noisy, and it was staffed by workers from the lower tiers who were dirty and frightening, and convicts from the deep gut prisons who were worse. The heat down there always gave him a headache, and the sulphurous air made him sneeze, and the flicker of the argon globes which lit the walkways hurt his eyes. But the Guild of Historians always made sure some of its staff were on hand when a town was being digested, and tonight he would have to join them and go about reminding the tough old foreman of the gut that any books and antiques aboard the new catch were the rightful property of his guild, and that history was just as important as bricks and iron and coal. He fought his way out of the elevator terminus and hurried towards the Guild of Historians warehouse, through tubular corridors lined with green ceramic tiles, and across metal catwalks high above the fiery gulfs of the digestion yards. Far below him he could see Salt Hook being torn to pieces. It looked tiny now, dwarfed by the vastness of London. Big, yellow, dismantling machines were crawling around it on tracks, and swinging above it on cranes, and clambering over it on hydraulic spider legs. Its wheels and axles had already been taken off, and work was starting on the chassis. Circular saws, as big as Ferris wheels, bit into the deck plates, throwing up plumes of sparks. Great blasts of heat came billowing from the furnaces and smelters, and before he had gone 20 paces, Tom could feel the sweat starting to soak through the armpits of his black uniform tunic. But when he finally reached the warehouse, things started to look a bit brighter. Salt Hook had not had a museum or a library, and the small heaps that had been salvaged from the town's junk shops were already being packed into crates for their journey up to Tier 2. If he was lucky, he might be allowed to finish early and catch the end of the celebrations. He wondered which guildsman was in charge tonight. If it was old Arkengarth or Dr. Weymouth, he was doomed. They always made you work your whole shift, whether there was anything to do or not. If it was Potty Pewtertide or Miss Plim, he might be all right. But as he hurried towards the supervisor's office, he began to realize that someone much more important than any of them was on gut duty tonight. There was a bug parked outside the office, a sleek black bug with the guild's emblem painted on its engine. Much too flash for any of the usual staff. 2 men in the livery of high-ranking guild staff stood, waiting beside it. They were rough-looking types, in spite of their plush clothes, and Tom knew at once who they were. Pusey and Gench, the reformed air pirates who had been the head historian's faithful servants for 20 years, and who piloted the 13th floor elevator whenever he flew off on an expedition. Valentine is here, Tom thought, and tried not to stare as he hurried past them up the steps. Thaddeus Valentine was Tom's hero, a former scavenger who had risen to become London's most famous archaeologist, and also its head historian, much to the envy and disgust of people like Pomeroy. Tom kept a picture of him tacked to the dormitory wall above his bunk, and he had read his books, Adventures of a Practical Historian and America Deserter Across the Dead Continent with Gun, Camera and Airship. I just read your comment, Carl. The proudest moment of his life had been when he was 12 and Valentine had come down to present the apprentices' end-of-year prizes, including the one Tom had won for an essay on identifying fake antiquities. He still remembered every word of the speech the great man had made. Never forget, apprentices, that we historians are the most important guild in our city. We don't make as much money as the merchants, but we create knowledge, which is worth a great deal more. We may not be responsible for steering London like the navigators, but where would the navigators be if we hadn't preserved the ancient maps and charts? And as for the Guild of Engineers, just remember that every machine they have ever developed is based on some fragment of old tech, ancient technology that our museum keepers have preserved, or our archaeologists have dug up. All Tom had been able to manage by way of reply was a mumbled, "Thank you, sir," before he scurried back to his seat. So it never occurred to him that Valentine would remember him. But when he opened the door of the supervisor's office, the great man looked up from his desk and grinned. "It's Natsworthy, isn't it? The apprentice who's so good at spotting fakes. I'll have to watch my step tonight or you'll find me out. It wasn't much of a joke, but it broke through the awkwardness that usually existed between an apprentice and a senior guildsman, and Tom relaxed enough to stop hovering on the threshold and step right inside, holding out his note from Pomeroy. Valentine jumped to his feet and came striding over to take it. He was a tall, handsome man of nearly 40, with a mane of silver-flecked black hair and a trim black beard. His grey mariner's eyes twinkled with humour, and on his forehead a third eye, the guild mark of the historian. The blue eye that looks backwards into time seemed to wink as he raised a quizzical eyebrow. Fighting, And what did apprentice Maleficent do to deserve a black eye? He was saying stuff about my mum and dad, sir, mumbled Tom. I see, the explorer nodded, watching the boy's face. Instead of telling him off, he asked, Are you the son of David and Rebecca Natsworthy? Yes, sir, admitted Tom, but I was only 6 when the big tilt happened. I don't really remember them. Valentine nodded again, and his eyes were sad and kind. They were good historians, Thomas. I hope you'll follow in their footsteps. Oh, yes, sir, said Tom. I hope so too. He thought of his poor mum and dad, killed when part of Cheapside collapsed onto the tier below. Nobody had ever spoken like that about them before, and he felt his eyes filling with tears. He felt as if he could tell Valentine anything at all, and he was just on the point of saying how much he missed his parents and how lonely and boring it was being a third-class apprentice, when a wolf walked into the office. It was a very large wolf, and white, and it appeared through the door that led out into the stock room. As soon as it saw Tom, it came running towards him, baring its yellow fangs. He shrieked, leaping on to a chair. A wolf! Oh, do behave, a girl's voice said, and a moment later the girl herself was there, bending over the beast and tickling the soft white ruff of fur under its chin. The fierce amber eyes closed happily, and Tom heard its tail whisking under her clothes. Don't worry, she laughed, smiling up at him. He's a lamb. He's a wolf, really, but he's as gentle as a lamb. Tom, said Valentine, his eyes twinkling with amusement, meet my daughter, Catherine, and Dog. Dog! Tom came down off his chair, feeling foolish and still a little scared. He had thought the brute must have escaped from the zoo in Circle Park. It's a long story, said Valentine. Catherine lived on the raft city of Puerto Angeles when she was 5. Then her mother died and she was sent to live with me. I brought Dog back for her as a present from my expedition to the ice wastes. But Catherine couldn't speak very much English in those days, and she'd never heard of wolves. So when she first saw him, she said, Dog, and it sort of stuck. He's perfectly tame, the girl promised, still smiling up at Tom. Father found him when he was just a cub. He had to shoot the mother, but he hadn't the heart to finish poor Dog off. He likes it best if you tickle his tummy. Dog, not father. She laughed. She had a lot of long, dark hair, and her father's grey eyes, and the same quick, dazzling smile. And she was dressed in the narrow silk trousers and flowing tunic. They were all the rage in high London that summer. Tom gazed at her in wonder. He had seen pictures of Valentine's daughter, but he had never realized how beautiful she was. Look, she said, he likes you. Dog had ambled over to sniff at the hem of Tom's tunic. His tail swished from side to side, and a wet, pink tongue rasped over Tom's fingers. If Dog likes people, said Catherine, I usually find I like them too. So come along, father, introduce us properly. Valentine laughed. Well, Kate, this is Tom Natsworthy, who has been sent down here to help, and if your wolf has finished with him, I think we will have to let him get to work. He put a kindly hand on Tom's shoulder. There's not much to be done. We'll just take a last look around the yards, and then... He glanced at the note from Pomeroy, and tore it up into little pieces and dropped them into the red recycling bin beside his desk. Then you can go. Tom was not sure what surprised him more, that Valentine was letting him off, or that he was coming down to the yards in person. Senior guildsmen usually preferred to sit in the comfort of the office and let the apprentices do the hard work down in the heat and fumes. But here was Valentine pulling off his black robes, clipping a pen into the pocket of his waistcoat, pausing to grin at Tom from the doorway. Come along then, he said. The sooner we start, the sooner you can be off to join in the fun in Kensington Gardens. Down they went, and down with Dog and Catherine following, down past the warehouse and on down twisting spirals of metal stairs to the digestion yards, where Salt Hook was growing smaller by the minute. All that remained of it now was a steel skeleton, and the machines were ripping even that apart, dragging deck plates and girders away to the furnaces to be melted down. Meanwhile, mountains of brick and slate and timber and salt and coal were trundling off on conveyor belts towards the heart of the gut, and skips of furniture and provisions were being wheeled clear by the salvage gangs. The salvage men were the true rulers of this part of London, and they knew it. They swaggered along the narrow walkways with the agility of tomcats, their bare chests shiny with sweat and their eyes hidden by tinted goggles. Tom had always been frightened of them, but Valentine hailed them with an easy charm and asked them if they had seen anything amongst the spoils that might be of interest to the museum. Sometimes he stopped to joke with them or ask them how their families were doing, and he was always careful to introduce them to my colleague, Mr. Natsworthy. Tom felt himself swell with pride. Valentine was treating him like a grown-up, and so the salvagemen treated him the same way, touching the peaks of their greasy caps and grinning as they introduced themselves. They all seemed to be called Len or Smudger. Take no notice of what they say about these chaps up at the museum, warned Valentine, as one of the Lens led them to a skip where some antiques had been stowed. Just because they live down in the nether boroughs and don't pronounce their H's doesn't mean they're fools. That's why I like to come down in person when the yards are working. I've often seen salvagemen and scavengers turn up artifacts that historians might have missed. Yes, sir, agreed Tom, glancing at Catherine. He longed to do something that would impress the head historian and his beautiful daughter. If only he could find some wonderful fragment of old tech amongst all this junk, something that would make them remember him after they had gone back to the luxury of high London. Otherwise, after this wander around the yards, he might never see them again. Hoping to amaze them, he hurried to the skip and looked inside. After all, old tech did turn up from time to time in small-town antique shops, or on an old lady's mantelpiece. Imagine being the one to rediscover some legendary secret, like heavier-than-air flying machines, or pot noodles. Even if it wasn't something that the Guild of Engineers could use, it might still end up in the museum, labelled and preserved in a display case with a notice saying, "Discovered by Mr. T. Natsworthy." He peered hopefully at the heap of salvage in the skip, shards of plastic lampstands, a flattened toy ground car. A small metal box caught his eye. When he pulled it out and opened it, his own face blinked back at him, reflected in a silvery plastic disc. "Mr. Valentine, look, a CD!" Mr. Valentine reached into the box, and lifted out the disc, tilting it so that rainbow light darted across its surface. "Quite right," he said. "The ancients used these in their computers as a way of storing information." "Could it be important?" asked Tom. Valentine shook his head. "I'm sorry, Thomas. The people of the old days may only have lived in static settlements, but their electronic machines were far beyond anything London's engineers have been able to build. Even if there is still something stored on this disk, we have no way of reading it. But it's a good find. Keep hold of it, just in case." He turned away as Tom put the CD back in its box and slid it into its pocket. But Catherine must have sensed Tom's disappointment, because she touched his hand and said, "It's lovely, Tom. Anything that has survived all these thousands of years is lovely, whether it's any use to the horrible old Guild of Engineers or not. I've got a necklace made of old computer disks." She smiled at him. She was as lovely as one of the girls in his daydreams, but kinder and funnier, and he knew that from now on the heroines he rescued in his imagination would all be Catherine Valentine. There was nothing else of interest in the skip. Salt Hook had been a practical sort of town, too busy gnawing at the old seabed to bother about digging up the past. But instead of going straight back to the warehouse, Valentine led his companions up another staircase and along a narrow catwalk to the incomers' station, where the former inhabitants were queuing to give their names to the clerk of admissions and be taken up to new homes in the hostels and workhouses of London. "Even when I'm not on duty," he explained, "I always make a point of going down to see the scavengers when we make a catch, before they have a chance to sell their finds on the Tier 5 antique markets and melt back into the out country." There were always some scavengers aboard a catch, townless wanderers who roamed the hunting ground on foot, scratching up old pieces of old tech. Salt Hook was no exception. At the end of a long queue of dejected townsfolk stood a group more ragged than the rest, with long, tattered coats that hung down to their ankles and goggles and dust masks slung about their grubby necks. Like most Londoners, Tom was horrified by the idea that people still actually lived on the bare earth. He hung back with Catherine and dog, but Valentine went over to speak with the scavengers. They came clustering round him, all except one, a tall, thin one in a black coat. A girl, Tom thought, although he could not be sure, because she wore a black scarf wrapped across her face like the turban of a desert nomad. He stood near her and watched while Valentine introduced himself to the other scavengers, and asked, "So, have any of you found anything the Historians' Guild might wish to purchase?" Some of the men nodded, some shook their heads. Some rummaged in their bulging packs. The girl in the black headscarf slid one hand inside her coat and said, "I have something for you, Valentine." She spoke so softly that only Tom and Catherine heard her, and as they turned to look, she suddenly sprang forward, whipping out a long, thin-bladed knife. Dun dun dun! Chapter 3. The Waste Chute. There was no time to think. Catherine screamed, dog growled. The girl hesitated for a moment, and Tom saw his chance and threw himself forward, grabbing her arm as she drove the knife at Valentine's heart. She hissed, writhing, and the knife dropped to the deck as she twisted free and darted away along the catwalk. "Stop her!" bellowed Valentine, starting forward, but the other refugees had seen the knife and were milling about in fright, barring his way. Several of the scavengers had pulled out firearms, and an armoured policeman came lumbering through the crowd like a huge blue beetle, shouting, "No guns allowed in London!" Glancing over the scavengers' heads, Tom glimpsed a dark silhouette against the distant glare of furnaces. The girl was at the far end of the catwalk, climbing nimbly up a ladder to a higher level. He ran after her and snatched at her ankle as she reached the top. He missed by a few inches, and at the same moment a dart hissed past him, striking sparks on the rungs. He looked back. 2 more policemen were thrusting through the crowd with crossbows raised. Beyond them he could see Catherine and her father watching him. "Don't shoot," he shouted. "I can catch her." He flung himself at the ladder and scrambled eagerly upwards, determined to be the one to capture the would-be assassin. He could feel his heart pounding with excitement. After all these dull years spent dreaming of adventures, suddenly he was having one. He had saved Mr. Valentine's life. He was a hero. The girl was already heading along the maze of high-level catwalks which led towards the furnace district. Hoping that Catherine could still see him, Tom set off in pursuit. The catwalk forked and narrowed, the handrails only a yard apart. Below him, the work of the digestion yard went on regardless. No one down there had noticed the drama being played out above their heads. He plunged through deep shadows and warm, blinding clouds of steam, with the girl always a few feet ahead. A low duct caught her headscarf and ripped it off. Her long hair was coppery in the dim glow of the furnaces, but Tom still couldn't see her face. He wondered if she was pretty. A beautiful assassin from the Anti-Traction League. He ducked past the dangling headscarf and ran on, gasping for breath, fumbling his collar open. Down a giddy spiral of iron stairs and out onto the floor of the digestion yards, flashing through the shadows of conveyor belts and huge spherical gas tanks. A gang of convict labourers looked up in amazement as the girl raced by. "Stop her!" yelled Tom. They just stood, gawping, as he passed. But when he looked back, he saw that one of the apprentice engineers who had been supervising them had broken off his work to join the chase. Tom immediately regretted shouting out. He wasn't going to give up his victory to some stupid engineer. He put on an extra spurt of speed so that he should be the one who caught her. Ahead, the way was barred by a circular hole in the deck plate, ringed by rusty handrails. A waste chute, scorched and blackened where clinker from the furnaces had been tipped down. The girl broke her pace for a moment, wondering which way to turn. When she went on, Tom had narrowed her lead. His outstretched fingers grabbed her pack. The strap broke, and she stopped and spun to face him, lit by the red glare of the smelters. She was no older than Tom, and she was hideous. A terrible scar ran down her face from forehead to jaw, making it look like a portrait that had been furiously crossed out. Her mouth was wrenched sideways in a permanent sneer, her nose was a smashed stump, and her single eye stared at him out of the wreckage, as grey and chill as a winter sea. "Why didn't you let me kill him?" she hissed. He was so shocked that he couldn't move or speak, could only stand there as the girl reached down for her fallen pack and turned to run on. But behind him, police whistles were blowing and crossbow darts came sparking against the metal deck plates and overhead ducts. The girl dropped the pack and fell sideways, gasping a filthy curse. Tom hadn't even imagined that girls knew such words. "Don't shoot!" he yelled, waving towards the policemen. They were lumbering down the spiral stair beyond the gas tanks, shooting as they came, as if they didn't care much that Tom was in the way. "Don't shoot!" The girl scrambled up, and he saw that a crossbow dart had gone through her leg, just above the knee. She clutched at it, blood welling out between her fingers. Her breath came in sobs as she backed up against the handrail, lifting herself awkwardly over it. Behind her, the waste chute gaped like an open mouth. Sorry, just stretching. No, shouted Tom, seeing what she meant to do. He didn't feel like a hero anymore. He just felt sorry for this poor, hideous girl, and guilty at being the one who had trapped her here. He held out his hand to her, willing her not to jump. I couldn't let you hurt Mr. Valentine, he said, shouting to make her hear him above the din of the gut. He's a good man, a kind, brave, wonderful. The girl lunged forward, shoving her awful, noseless face toward him. Look at me, she said, her voice all twisted by her twisted mouth. Look what your brave, kind Valentine did to me. What do you mean? Ask him, she screamed. Ask him what he did to Hester Shaw. The police were closer now. Tom could feel their footsteps drumming on the deck. The girl glanced past him, then heaved her wounded leg over the handrail, crying out at the pain. No, pleaded Tom again, but too late. Her ragged greatcoat snapped and fluttered, and she was gone. He flung himself forward and peered down the shadowed chute. A cool blast of air came up at him, mingled with the smell of mud and crushed vegetation, the smell of the speeding earth beneath the city. She had jumped right out of the city to her death. Hester Shaw. He would have to remember that name and say a prayer for her to one of London's many gods. Shapes loomed out of the drifting smoke. The policemen were advancing cautiously, like watchful crabs, and Valentine was with them, running ahead. In the shadows under a gas tank, Tom saw the young engineer looking on, shocked. Tom tried to smile at him, but his face felt frozen, and the next moment another thick swag of smoke had folded over him, blotting out everything. Tom, are you all right? Valentine ran up, barely winded by the long chase. Where is she? Where is the girl? Dead, Tom said, lamely. Valentine stood beside him at the handrail and peered over. The shadows of the drifting smoke moved over his face like cobwebs. There was a strange light in his eyes, and his face was tight and white and frightened. Did you see her, Tom? Did she have a scar? Yes, said Tom, wondering how Valentine could know that. It was horrible. Her eye was gone, and her nose. Then he remembered the terrible thing the girl had told him, and he said, and she said, but he wasn't sure if he should tell Mr. Valentine what she had said. It was a lie. Insane. She said her name was Hester Shaw. Great quirk, hissed Valentine, and Tom flinched backwards, wishing he had never mentioned it. But when he looked up again, Valentine was smiling kindly at him, his eyes full of sorrow. Don't worry, Tom, he said. I'm sorry. Tom felt a big, gentle hand on his shoulder, and then he was never quite sure how it happened. A twist, a shove, and he was pitching over the handrail and falling, just as Hester Shaw had fallen, flailing wildly for a hold on the smooth metal at the brim of the waste chute. He pushed me, he thought, but it was more amazement that he felt than fear as the black throat swallowed him down into the dark. Ooh. My mouth is dry, I'm sorry. Nom, 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 nom. Chapter 4. The Out Country. Silence. Silence. He couldn't understand it. Even when London wasn't moving, there was usually some sort of noise in the dormitory. The whir of ventilators, the hum and rattle of distant elevator shafts, the snores of other apprentices in the neighbouring bunks. But now, silence. His head ached. In fact, all of him ached. His bunk felt strange too, and when he moved his hands there was something cold and slimy that oozed between his fingers, like mud. He sat up, gasping. He wasn't in the third-class dormitory at all. He was lying on a great hump-backed mound of mud on the edge of a deep trench, and in the thin, pearl-grey light of dawn he could see the girl with the ruined face sitting nearby. His horrible dream of sliding down that fire-blackened chute had been true. He had fallen out of London, and he was alone with Hester Shaw on the bare earth. He moaned in terror, and the girl glanced quickly round at him and then away. "You're alive then," she said. "I thought you'd died." She sounded as if she didn't care much either way. Tom scrambled up onto all fours, so that only his knees and his toes and the palms of his hands were touching the mud. His arms were bare, and when he looked down he saw that his bruised body was naked to the waist. His tunic lay on the mud nearby, but he couldn't find his shirt at all, until he crawled closer to the scarred girl and realized that she was busily tearing it into strips, which she was using to bandage her wounded leg. "Hey," he said, "that's one of my best shirts." "So," she replied without looking up, "it's one of my best legs." He pulled his tunic on. It was tattered and filthy from his fall down the waist chute, full of rents that had let the chill out-country air through. He hugged himself, shivering. Valentine pushed me. He pushed me, and I fell down the shaft into the out-country. He pushed me. No, he can't have done. It must have been a mistake. I slipped, and he tried to grab me. That's what must have happened. Hester Shaw finished her bandaging and stood up, grunting at the pain, as she pulled her filthy, blood-stiffened breeches on over the wound. Then she threw what was left of Tom's shirt back at him, a useless rag. "You should have let me kill him," she said, and turned away, setting off with a kind of furious limp up the long curve of mud. Tom watched her go, too shocked and bewildered to move. It was only when she vanished over the top of the slope that he realized he didn't want to be left alone here. He would prefer any company, even hers, to the silence. He flung the torn shirt away and ran after her, slithering in the thick, clagging mud, stubbing his toes on fragments of rock and torn-up roots. The deep, sheer-walled trench yawned on his left, and as he reached the crest of the rise, he realized that it was just one of 100 identical trenches, the huge track marks of London stretching ruler straight into the distance. Far, far ahead he saw his city, dark against the brightening eastern sky, wrapped in the smoke of its own engines. He felt the cold tug of homesickness. Everyone he had ever known was aboard that dwindling mountain. Everyone except Hester, who was stomping angrily after it, dragging her injured leg behind her. "Stop!" he shouted, half running, half wading to catch her up. "Hester! Miss Shaw!" "Leave me alone," she snapped. "But where are you going?" "I've got to get back into London, haven't I?" she said. 2 years it took me to find it, trudging across the out-country on foot, jumping aboard little townlets in the hope it would be London that scoffed them. And when I finally get there and find Valentine, come down to strut around the yards just like the scavengers told me he would. What happens? Some idiot stops me from cutting his heart out like he deserves. She stopped walking and turned to face Tom. If you hadn't shoved your oar in, he'd be dead, and I'd have fallen down and died beside him, and I'd be at peace by now. Tom stared at her, and before he could stop himself, his eyes filled with stinging tears. He hated himself for looking like a fool in front of Hester Shaw, but he couldn't help it. The shock of what had happened to him and the thought of being abandoned out here overwhelmed him, and the hot tears flooded down his face and cut white runnels through the mud on his cheeks. Hester, who had been on the point of turning away, stopped and watched, as if she wasn't sure what was happening to him. "You're crying," she said at last, quite gently, sounding surprised. "Sorry," he sniffed. "I never cry. I can't. I didn't even cry when Valentine murdered my mum and dad." "What?" Tom's voice was all wobbly from weeping. "Mr. Valentine would never do something like that. Catherine said he couldn't even bring himself to shoot a wolf cub. You're lying." "How come you're here then?" she asked, mocking him. "He shoved you out after me, didn't he? Just because you'd seen me?" "You're lying," said Tom again, but he remembered those big hands thrusting him forward, remembered falling, and the strange light that had shone in the archaeologist's eyes. "Well?" asked Hester. "He pushed me," murmured Tom, amazed. Hester Shaw just shrugged, as if to say, See what he's really like?" Then she turned away and started walking again. Tom hurried along at her side. "I'll come with you. I've got to get back to London too. I'll help you." "You?" She gave a hissing laugh and spat on the mud at his feet. "I thought you were Valentine's man. You want to help me kill him?" Tom shook his head. He didn't know what he wanted. Part of him still clung to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding and Valentine was good and kind and brave. He certainly didn't want to see him murdered and poor Catherine left without a father. But he had to catch up with London somehow. And he couldn't do it alone. And anyway, he felt responsible for Hester Shaw. It was his fault that she had been wounded after all. "I'll help you walk," he said. "You're injured. You need me." "I don't need anybody," she said fiercely. "We'll go after London together," Tom promised. I'm a member of the Guild of Historians. They'll listen to me. I'll tell Mr. Pomeroy. If Valentine really did the things you said, then the law will deal with him." "The law?" she scoffed. "Valentine is the law in London. Isn't he the Lord Mayor's favourite? Isn't he the head historian? No, he'll kill me unless I kill him first. Kill you too, probably." She mimed drawing a sword and driving it through Tom's chest. The sun was rising, lifting wreaths of steam from the wet mud. London was still moving, visibly smaller since the last time he looked. The city usually stopped for a few days when it had eaten, and some part of Tom's brain that was not quite numb wondered idly, where on earth is it going? But just then the girl stumbled and fell, her bad leg crumpling under her. Tom scrambled to help her up. She didn't thank him, but she didn't push him away either. He pulled her arm around his shoulders and hauled her up, and they set off together along the mud ridge, following London's tracks into the east. Chapter 5. Thank you, Koo. Chapter 5. The Lord Mayor. Do you pronounce it mayor or mayor? Make sure you guys are stretching. 100 miles ahead, the sunrise shone on Circle Park, the elegant loop of lawns and flower beds that encircled Tier 1. It gleamed in ornamental lakes and on pathways glistening with dew, and it glittered on the white metal spires of Cleo House, Valentine's villa, which stood among dark cedars at the park's edge like some gigantic conch shell abandoned by a freak high tide. In her bedroom on the top floor, Catherine awoke and lay watching the sunbeams filter through the tortoise-shell shutters on her window. She knew she was unhappy, but at first she did not know why. Then she remembered the previous evening, the attack in the gut, and how that poor, sweet young apprentice had chased after the assassin and got himself killed. She had gone running after father, but by the time she reached the waste chute, it was all over. A young apprentice engineer was stumbling away, his shocked face as white as his rubber coat, and beyond him she found father, looking pale and angry, surrounded by policemen. She had never seen him look like that before, nor heard the harsh, unnatural voice in which he snapped at her to go straight home. Part of her just wanted to curl up and go back to sleep. But she had to see him and make sure he was all right. She flung back the quilt and got up, pulling on the clothes from last night that lay all crumpled on the floor, still smelling of the furnaces. Outside her bedroom door, a hallway sloped gently downwards, round-roofed, curling about on itself like the inside of an ammonite. She hurried down it, pausing to pay her respects before the statue of Cleo, goddess of history, who stood in a niche outside the door to the dining room. In other niches lay treasures that her father had brought back from his expeditions. Potsherds, fragments of computer keyboards, and the rusty metal skulls of stalkers, those strange, half-mechanical soldiers from a forgotten war. Their cracked glass eyes stared balefully at Catherine as she hurried by. Ow. Father was drinking coffee in the atrium, the big open space at the centre of the house. He was still in his dressing gown, his long face serious as he paced up and down between the potted ferns. A glance at his eyes was enough to tell Catherine that he had not slept at all. "Father," she asked, "what's happened?" "Oh, Kate," he came and hugged her tight. "What a night!" "That poor boy," Catherine whispered. "Poor Tom. I suppose they didn't find anything?" Valentine shook his head. The assassin dragged him with her when she jumped. They were both drowned in the mud of the out-country or crushed beneath the tracks. Excuse me. "Oh," whispered Catherine, and sat down on the edge of a table, not even noticing Dog when he came padding in to rest his great head on her knee. Poor Tom, she thought. He had been so sweet, so eager to please. She had really liked him. She had even thought of asking father about bringing him up to work at Cleo House, so she and Dog could get to know him better. And now he was dead. His soul fled down to the sunless country, and his body lying cold in the cold mud, somewhere in the city's wake. "The Lord Mayor isn't happy," said Valentine, glancing at the clock. "An assassin loose in the gut on London's first day back in the hunting ground. He is coming down here in person to discuss it. Will you sit with me while I wait for him? You can have some of my breakfast if you like. There is coffee on the table, rolls, butter. I have no appetite at all." Catherine had no appetite either, but she glanced at the food and noticed a battered leather pack lying on the far side of the table. It was the pack the girl assassin had dropped in the gut last night, and its contents were spread out around it like exhibits in a strange museum. a metal water bottle, a first aid kit, some string, a few strips of dried meat that looked tougher than the tongues of old boots, and a stained and crumpled sheet of paper with a photograph stapled to it. Catherine picked it up. It was an identity form issued in a town called Stroll, filthy and faded and coming apart along the creases. Before she could study the writing, her eye was drawn to the photograph. She gasped, "Father, her face!" Valentine turned, saw her holding the paper, and snatched it from her hand with an angry cry. "No, Kate, this is not for your eyes. It is not for anybody's eyes." He pulled out his lighter and carefully lit a corner of the form, folding it into the ashtray on his deck as it burned. Then he went back to his pacing, and Catherine sat and watched him. In the 10 years since she arrived in London, Catherine had come to think of him as her best friend, as well as her father. They liked the same things and laughed at the same jokes, and never kept secrets from each other. But she could see that he was keeping something from her about this girl. She had never seen him so worried by anything. "Who is she, father?" she asked. "Do you know her from one of your expeditions? She is so young and so... Whatever happened to her face?" There were footsteps, a knock at the door, and Pusey walked into the room. "Lord Mayor's on his way, Chief." "Already?" gasped Valentine. "Afraid so. Gench just saw him coming across the park in his bug. Said he didn't look pleased." Valentine didn't look pleased either. He grabbed his robes from the chair back where they had been flung and started trying to make himself presentable. Catherine stepped forward to help, but he waved her away, so she kissed him quickly on the cheek and hurried out with Dog trotting behind her. Through the big oval windows of the drawing room, she could see a white official bug pulling in through the gates of Clio House. A squad of soldiers ran ahead of it, dressed in the bright red armour of the Beefeaters, the Lord Mayor's personal bodyguard. They took up positions around the garden like ugly lawn ornaments as Gench and one of the other servants hurried forward to open the bug's plastic lid. The Lord Mayor stepped out and came striding towards the house. Magnus Crome had been ruler of London for nearly 20 years, but he still didn't look like a Lord Mayor. The Lord Mayors in Catherine's history books were chubby, merry red-faced men, but Crome was as thin as an old crow and twice as gloomy. He didn't even wear the scarlet robes that had been the pride and joy of other mayors, but still dressed in his long white rubber coat and wore the red wheel of the Guild of Engineers upon his brow. Those earlier Lord Mayors had had their guild marks removed to show that they were serving the whole of London. But things had changed when Crome seized power, and even if some people said it was unfair for one man to be Master of the Engineers and Lord Mayor, they still admitted that Crome made a good job of running the city. Catherine didn't like him. She had never liked him, even though he had been so good to her father, and she was not in any mood to meet him this morning. As soon as she heard the front door iris open, she hurried back into the corridor and started up it, calling softly for Dog to follow her. She stopped as soon as she was around the first bend, hidden in a shallow alcove, resting the tips of her fingers on the wolf's head to keep him still. She could tell that some terrible trouble had overtaken her father, and she was not going to let him keep the truth from her as if she was still a little girl. A few seconds later, she saw Gench arrive at the door of the atrium, clutching his hat in his hands. "This way, your worshipful honour," he mumbled, bowing. "Mind your step, your mayorness." Close behind came Crome. He paused for a moment, his head flicking from side to side in an oddly reptilian way. and Catherine felt his gaze sweep the corridor like a wind from the ice wastes. She squeezed herself tighter into the alcove and prayed to Quirk and Cleo that he could not see her. For a moment she could hear his breathing and the faint squeaks and creakings of his rubber coat. Then Gench led him into the atrium and the danger was past. With one hand firmly on Dog's collar, she crept back to the door and listened. She could hear Father's voice and imagined him standing beside the ornamental fountain while his men showed Chrome to a seat. He started to make some polite comment about the weather, but the cold, thin voice of the mayor interrupted him. "I have been reading your report of the last night's escapade, Valentine. You assured me that the whole family had been dealt with." Catherine flinched away from the door as though it had burned her. How dare the old man talk to Father like that? She did not want to hear any more, but curiosity got the better of her, and she set her ear against the wood again. A ghost from my past," Father was saying. "I can't imagine how she escaped, and Quirk alone knows where she learned to be so agile and cunning. But she is dead now. So is the boy who caught her. Poor Natsworthy." "You are sure of that?" "They fell out of the city, Chrome." "That means nothing. We are travelling over soft ground. They may have survived. You should have sent men down to check. Remember, we don't know how much of the girl knew of her mother's work. If she were to tell another city that we have Medusa, before we are ready to use it—" I know," said Valentine irritably, and Catherine heard a chair creak as he flung himself down in it. "I'll take the 13th floor elevator back and see if I can find the bodies." "No," ordered Chrome. "I have other plans for you in your airship. I want you to fly ahead and see what lies between London and its goal." "Chrome, that is a job for a planning committee scoutship, not the elevator." "No," snapped Chrome again. "I don't want too many people to know where we are taking the city. They will find out when the time is ripe. Besides, I have a task in mind that only you can be trusted with." "And the girl?" asked Valentine. "Don't worry about her," said the Lord Mayor. "I have an agent who can be relied on to track her down and finish the job you failed to do. Concentrate on preparing your airship, Valentine." The meeting was at an end. Catherine heard the Lord Mayor getting ready to leave and hurried away up the corridor before the door opened, her mind whirling faster than one of the tumble dryers in the London Museum's Hall of Ancient Technology. Back in her room, she sat down to wonder about the things she had heard. She had hoped to solve a mystery, but instead it had grown deeper. All she was sure of was that Father had a secret. He had never kept anything from her before. He always told her everything, and asked her opinion, and wanted her advice. But now he was whispering with the Lord Mayor about the girl being a ghost from his past, and some agent being sent back to look for her and do what? Could Tom and the assassin really still be alive? And why was the Lord Mayor packing Father off on a reconnaissance flight amid such secrecy? And why didn't he want to say where London was going? And what on earth was Medusa? Chapter 6. Chapter 6. Okay. Speedwell. All that day they struggled onwards, trudging along in the scar that London had clawed through the soft earth of the hunting ground. The city was never out of their sight, but it grew smaller and smaller, more and more distant, pulling away from them towards the east. And Tom realized that it might soon be lost forever beyond the horizon. Loneliness wrenched at him. He had never much enjoyed his life as an apprentice historian, but now his years in the museum felt like a beautiful, golden dream. He found himself missing fussy old Dr. Arkengarth and pompous Chudley Pomeroy. He missed his bunk in the draughty dormitory and the long hours of work, and he missed Catherine Valentine, although he had known her for only a few minutes. Sometimes, if he closed his eyes, he could see her face quite clearly, her kind grey eyes and her lovely smile. He was sure that she didn't know what sort of man her father was. "Watch where you're going," snapped Hester Shaw, and he opened his eyes and realized that he had almost led her over the brink of one of the gaping track marks. On they went, and Tom started to think what he missed most about his city was the food. It had never been up to much, the stuff they served in the guild canteen, but it was better than nothing, and nothing was what he had now. When he asked Hester Shaw what they were supposed to live on out here, she just said, "I bet you wish you hadn't lost my pack for me now, London boy. I had some good dried dog meat in my pack." Gross. Sorry, I just need to sit up. Hang on. "I bet you wish you hadn't lost my pack for me now, London boy. I had some good dried dog meat in my pack." In the early afternoon, they came across a few dull, greyish bushes that London's tracks had not quite buried, and Hester tore some leaves off and mashed them to a pulp between two stones. "They'd be better cooked," she said, as they ate the horrible vegetable goo. "I had the makings of a fire in my pack." Later, she caught a frog in one of the deep pools that were already forming in the chevroned track prints. She didn't offer Tom any, and he tried not to watch while she ate it. He still did not know what to make of her. She was silent mostly, and glared so fiercely at him when he tried to talk to her that he quickly learned to walk in silence too. But sometimes, quite suddenly, she would start talking. "The land's rising," she might say. "That means London'll go slower. It would waste fuel, going full speed on an uphill stretch." Then, an hour or two later, "My mum used to say traction studies are stupid. She said there was a reason for them 1,000 years ago when there were all those earthquakes and volcanoes and glaciers pushing south. Now they just keep rolling around and eating each other because people are too stupid to stop them." Tom liked it when she talked, even though he did think her mum sounded like a dangerous anti-tractionist. But when he tried to keep the conversation going, she would go quiet again, and her hand would go up to hide her face. It was as if there were two Hesters sharing the same thin body, one a grim avenger who had thought only of killing Valentine, the other a quick, clever, likeable girl whom he sometimes sensed peeking out at him from behind that scarred mask. He wondered if she was slightly mad. It would be enough to send anyone mad, seeing your parents murdered. "How did it happen?" he asked her, gently. "I mean, your mum and dad. Are you sure it was Valentine?" "Shut up and walk," she said. But, long after dark, as they huddled in a hollow of the mud to escape the chill night wind, she suddenly started telling him her story. "I was born on the bare earth," she said, "but it wasn't like this. I lived on Oak Island in the far west. It used to be part of the hunting ground once, but the earthquakes drowned all the land around it and made an island of it. Too far offshore for any hungry city to attack, and too rocky for the amphibious towns to get at. It was lovely, green hills and great outcrops of stone, and the streams running through tangly oak woods, all grey with lichen, the trees shaggy with it, like old dogs." Tom shuddered. Every Londoner knew that only savages lived on the bare earth. "I prefer a nice firm deck plate under me," he said, But Hester didn't seem to hear him. The words kept spilling out of her twisted mouth as if she had no choice in the matter. There was a town there called Dunroman. It was mobile once, but the people got sick of running all the time from bigger towns, so they floated it across to Oak Island and took its wheels and engines off and dug it into a hillside. It's been sitting there 100 years or more, and you'd never know it used to move at all. But that's awful, Tom gasped. It's downright anti-tractionist. My mum and dad lived down the road away, she went on, talking straight over him. They had a house on the edge of the moor where the sea comes in. Dad was a farmer, and Mum was a historian like you, only a lot cleverer than you, of course. She flew off each summer in her airship, digging for old tech, but in the autumn she'd come home. I used to go up to her study in the attic on winter's nights and eat cheese on toast, and she'd tell me about her adventures. Then, one night, 7 years ago, I woke up late, and there were voices in the attic arguing. So I went up the ladder and looked, and Valentine was there. I knew him, 'cause he was Mum's friend, and used to drop in on us when he was passing. Only he wasn't being very friendly that night. "Give me the machine, Pandora," he kept saying. "Give me Medusa." He didn't see me watching him. I was at the top of the ladder, looking into the attic, too scared to go up and too scared to go back. Valentine had his back to me, and Mum was stood facing him, holding this machine, and she said, "Damn you, Thaddeus. I found it. It's mine." And then Valentine drew his sword, and he... She paused for breath. She wanted to stop, but she was riding a wave of memory, and it was carrying her backwards to that night, that room, and the blood that had splattered her mother's star charts, like the map of a new constellation. And then he turned round and saw me watching, and he came at me, and I dived back so his sword only cut my face, and I fell back down the ladder. He must have thought he'd killed me. I heard him go to Mum's desk and start rustling through the papers there, and I got up and ran. Dad was lying on the kitchen floor. He was dead. Even the dogs were dead. I ran out of the house and saw Valentine's great black ship moored at the end of the garden, with his men waiting. They came after me, but I escaped. I ran down to the boathouse and shoved off in Dad's skiff. I think I meant to go round to Dunroman and get help. I was only little, and I thought a doctor would help Mum and Dad, but I was so weak with the pain and all the blood. I untied the boat somehow, and the current swept it out. And the next thing I knew, I was waking up on the shores of the hunting ground. I lived in the out country after that. At first, I didn't remember much. It was as if he cut my head open and some of my memories spilled out, and the rest got muddled about. But slowly I started remembering, and one day I remembered Valentine and what he'd done. That's when I decided to come and find him, kill him the same way he killed my mum and dad. "What was this machine?" asked Tom in the long silence. "This Medusa thing?" Hester shrugged. It was too dark to see her by this time, but he heard her shrug, the hunch of her shoulders inside her filthy coat. "Something that my mum found. Old tech. It didn't look important. Like a metal football, all bashed and dented. But that's what he killed her for." 7 years ago, whispered Tom. "That's when Mr. Valentine got made head of the guild. They said he'd found something in the out country, and Crome was so pleased that he promoted him, straight over the heads of Chudley Pomeroy and all the rest. But I never heard what it was he'd found, and I never heard of a Medusa before." Hester said nothing at all. After a few minutes she began to snore. Tom sat awake for a long time, turning her story over and over in his mind. He thought of the daydreams that had kept him going through long, tedious days in the museum. He had dreamed of being trapped in the out country with a beautiful girl, on the trail of some murderous criminal, but he had never imagined it would be so wet and cold, or that his legs would ache so, or that the murderer would be London's greatest hero. And as for the beautiful girl, he looked at the blunt wreck of Hester Shaw's face in the faint moonlight, scowling even in her sleep. He understood her better now. She hated Valentine, but she hated herself even more, for being so ugly and for being still alive when her parents were dead. He remembered how he had felt when the big tilt happened, and he came home and found his house flattened and his mum and dad gone. He had thought that it was all his fault somehow. He had felt full of guilt because he had not been there to die with them. I must help her, he thought. I won't let her kill Mr. Valentine, but I'll find a way to get the truth out. If it is the truth. Maybe tomorrow London will have slowed down a bit, and Hester's leg will be a bit better. We'll be back in the city by sundown, and somebody will listen to us. But next morning they woke to find that the city was even further ahead, and Hester's leg was worse. She moaned with pain at almost every step now. Her face was the colour of old snow, and fresh blood was soaking through her bandages and running down into her boot. Tom cursed himself for throwing those rags of shirt away, and for making Hester lose her pack and her first aid kit. In the middle of the morning, through shifting veils of rain, they saw something ahead of them. A pile of slag and clinker lay spilled across the track marks, where London had vented it the day before. Drawn up beside it was a strange little town. As they got closer, Hester and Tom could see that people were scrambling up and down the spoil heap, sifting out collops of melted metal and fragments of unburnt fuel. The sight gave them hope, and they pressed forward faster. By early afternoon they were walking under the shadow of the townlet's huge wheels, and Tom was staring up in amazement at its single tier. It was smaller than a lot of the houses in London, and it appeared to have been built out of wood by somebody whose idea of good carpentry was to bang a couple of nails in and hope for the best. Behind the shed-like town rose the crooked chimneys of an experimental engine array. "Welcome!" shouted a tall, white-bearded man, picking his way down the clinker heap, grubby brown robes flapping. "Welcome to Speedwell. I am Orm Rayland, Mayor. Do you speak English?" Hester hung back suspiciously, but Tom thought the old man looked friendly enough. He stepped forward and said, "Please, sir, we need some food, and a doctor to look at my friend's leg." "I'm not your friend," hissed Hester Shaw, "and there's nothing wrong with my leg." But she was white and trembling, and her face shone with sweat. "No doctor in Speedwell anyway," laughed Rayland. "Not one. And as for food, well, times are hard. Do you have anything you can trade?" Tom patted the pockets of his tunic. He had a little money, but he didn't see what use London money would have to Orm Rayland. Then he touched something hard. It was the CD he'd found in the gut. He pulled it out and looked wistfully at it for a moment before he handed it to the old man. He had been planning to make a present of it to Catherine Valentine one day, but now food was more important. "Pretty, very pretty," admired Rayland, tilting the disc and admiring the rippling rainbows. "Not a lot of use, but worth a few nights' shelter and a bit of food. It's not very good food, mind, but it's better than nothing." He was right. It wasn't very good, but Tom and Hester ate greedily anyway, and then held out their bowls for more. "It's made from algae, mostly," explained Orm Rayland, as his wife slopped out heaping seconds of the bluish muck. We throw it in vats down under the main engine room. Nasty stuff. But it keeps body and soul together when pickings is thin. And between you and me, pickings has never been thinner. That's why we were so glad to come across this mound of trash we're scraping through. Tom nodded, leaning back in his chair and looking around the Raylands' quarters. It was a tiny, cheese-shaped room, and not at all what he would have expected for a mayoral residence. But then, Orm Rayland was not exactly what he would have expected of a mayor. The shabby old man seemed to rule over a town composed mainly of his own family. Sons and daughters, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and the husbands and wives that they had met on passing towns. But Rayland was not a happy man. It's no fun running a traction town, he kept saying. No fun at all, not anymore. There was a time when a little place like Speedwell could go about its business quite safely, being too small for any other town to bother eating, but not now, not with prey so scarce. Everyone we see wants to eat us. We even found ourselves running from a city the other day, one of those big Frankish-speaking Ville-mobile it was. I ask you, what good would a place like Speedwell be to a monster like that? We'd barely take the edge off its appetite, but they chased us anyway. Your town must be very fast, said Tom. Oh yes, agreed Rayland, beaming, and his wife put in, 100 miles an hour, top speed. That's Rayland's doing. He's a wizard with those big engines of his. Could you help us? Asked Tom, leaning forward in his seat. We need to get to London as quickly as possible. I'm sure you could catch it up, and there might be more spoil heaps along the way. Bless you, lad, said Rayland, shaking his head. What London drops isn't worth going far for, not these days. Everything's recycled now that prey's so short. Why, I remember the days when Sooty's waste heaps used to dot the hunting ground like mountains. Oh, there was good pickings then, but not any more. Besides, he added with a shudder, I wouldn't take my town too close to London, or any other city. You can't trust them these days. They'd turn round and snaffle us, like as not. Chomp. No. Tom nodded, trying not to show his disappointment. He glanced across at Hester, but her head was hanging down, and she seemed to be asleep, or unconscious. He hoped it was just the effects of her long walk and her full stomach. But as he started up to check that she was all right, Rayland said, I tell you what, though, lad. We'll take you to the cluster. To the what? To the trading cluster. It's a gathering of small towns, a couple of days run southeast of here. We were going anyway. There will be lots of towns at the cluster, Mrs. Rayland agreed, and even if none of them is prepared to take you and your friend to London, you'll soon find an air trader who will. Bound to be air traders at a cluster. Ah, said Tom, and stopped. He wasn't feeling very well. The room seemed to waver, then started to roll like the picture on a badly turned goggle screen. He looked at Hester and saw that she had slipped off his seat onto the floor. The Raylands' household gods grinned at him from their shrine on the wall, and one of them seemed to be saying in Orm Rayland's voice, Sure to be airships there, Tom. Always airships at a trading cluster. Would you like some more algae, dear? Inquired Mrs. Rayland as he fell to his knees. From a long, long way away he heard her saying, It took an awfully long time to take effect, didn't it, Ormy? And Rayland replying, We'll have to put more in next time, my sweet. Then the swirling patterns on the carpet reached up and twined around him and pulled him down into a sleep that was as soft as cotton wool and filled with dreams of Catherine. Chapter 7. High London. Above Tier 1, above the busy shops of Mayfair, Jared! Above Tier 1, above the busy shops of Mayfair and Piccadilly, above Quirk Circus, where the statue of London's saviour stands proudly on its fluted steel column, a top tier hangs over the city like an iron crown, supported by vast pillars. It is the smallest, highest, and most important of the 7 tiers, and though only 3 buildings stand there, they are the 3 greatest buildings in London. To sternward rise the towers of the Guildhall, where the greater and lesser guilds all have their offices and meet in council once a month. Opposite is the building where the real decisions are taken, the black glass claw of the Engineerium. Between them stands St. Paul's, the ancient Christian temple that Quirk re-erected up here when he turned London into Attraction City. It is a sad sight now, covered in scaffolding and shored up with props, for it was never meant to move, and London's journeys have shaken the old stonework terribly. But soon it will be open to the public again. The Guild of Engineers has promised to restore it. And if you listen closely, you can hear the drills and hammers of their men at work inside. Magnus Crome hears them as his bug goes purring through the old cathedral's shadow to the Engineerium. They make him smile, a faint, secret smile. Inside the Engineerium, the sunlight is kept at bay behind black windows. A cold neon glow washes the metal walls, and the air smells of antiseptic, which Crome thinks is a welcome relief from the stench of flowers and new mown grass that hangs over High London on this warm spring day. A young apprentice leaps to attention as he stalks into the lobby and bows her bald head when he barks, "Take me to Dr. Twix." A monorail car is waiting. The apprentice helps the Lord Mayor into it and takes him sweeping up in a slow spiral through the heart of the Engineerium. He passes floor after floor of offices and conference rooms and laboratories, and glimpses the shapes of strange machines through walls of frosted glass. Everywhere he looks, he sees his engineers at work, tinkering with fragments of old tech, performing experiments on rats and dogs, or guiding groups of shaven-headed children who are up on a day trip from the guild's nurseries in the deep gut. He feels safe and satisfied here in the clean, bright inner sanctum of his guild. It makes him remember why he loves London so much, and why he has devoted his whole career to finding ways to keep it moving. When Crome was a young apprentice many years ago, he read gloomy forecasts which said that prey was running out and traction cities were doomed. He has made it his life's work to prove them wrong, clawing his way to the top of his guild, and then on to the Lord Mayor's throne was just the start. His fierce recycling and anti-waste laws were merely a stopgap. Now he is almost ready to unveil his real plan. But first he must be certain that the Shaw girl can make no more trouble. The car comes sighing to a halt outside one of the upper laboratories. A squat, white-coated barrel of a woman stands waiting at the entrance. Hopping nervously from foot to foot, Evadne Twix is one of the best engineers in London. She may look like someone's dotty auntie and decorate her laboratory with pictures of flowers and puppies, a clear breach of guild rules. But when it comes to her work, she is utterly ruthless. "Hello, Lord Mayor," she simpers, bowing. "How lovely to see you. Have you come to visit my babies?" "I want to see Shrike," he snaps, brushing past, and she dances along in his wake like a leaf in the slipstream of a passing city. Through her laboratory they go, past startled, bowing engineers, past glittering racks of glassware, and past tables where rusting metal skeletons are being painstakingly repaired. Dr. Twix's team has spent years studying the stalkers. the resurrected men whose remains turn up sometimes in the out-country, and lately they have had more than just remains to work on. "Have you completed your researches on Shrike?" asks Crone as he strides along. "You are certain he is of no further use to us?" "Oh, I've learned everything we can," Lord Mayor twitters the doctor. "He's a fascinating piece of work, but really far more complicated than is good for him. He has almost developed his own personality, and as for his strange fixation with this girl, I shall make sure my new models are much simpler. Do you wish me to have him dismantled?" "No." Chrome stops at a small round door and touches a stud that sends it whirling open. I intend to keep my promise to Shrike, and I have a job for him." Beyond the door hang shadows and a smell of oil. A tall shape stands motionless against a far wall. As the Lord Mayor steps into the room, two round green eyes snap on like headlights. "Mr. Shrike," says Chrome, sounding almost cheery. "How are we today? I hope you were not asleep." "I do not sleep," replies a voice from the darkness. It is a horrible voice, sharp as the squeal of rusty cogs. Even Dr. Twix, who knows it well, shudders inside her rubber coat. "Do you wish to examine me again?" "No, Shrike," Chrome says. "Do you remember what you warned me of when you first came to me 1.5 years ago? About the Shaw girl? I told you that she is alive and on her way to London. Well, it seems you were right. She turned up just as you said she would." "Where is she? Bring her to me." "Impossible, I'm afraid. She jumped down a waste chute back out into the out-country." There was a slow hiss, like steam escaping. "I must go after her." Chrome smiles. "I was hoping you'd say that. One of my guild's Goshawk 90 reconnaissance airships has been made ready for you. The pilots will retrace the city's tracks until you find where the girl fell. If she and her companion are dead, all well and good. If they are alive, kill them. Bring their bodies to me." "And then?" asks the voice. "And then, Shrike," Chrome replies, "I will give you your heart's desire." It was a strange time for London. The city was still travelling at quite high speed, as if there was a catch in sight, but there was no other town to be seen on the grey, muddy plains of the north-western hunting ground, and everybody was wondering what the Lord Mayor could be planning. "We can't just go driving on like this," Catherine heard one of her servants mutter. "There are big cities further east, and they'll scoff us up and spit out the bones." But Mrs. Mello, the housekeeper, whispered back, "Don't you know nothing, Sooky Blinder? Ain't Mr. Valentine himself been sent off on a expedition to spy on the land ahead? Him and Magnus Chrome have got their eye on some vast great prize. You can be sure of it." Some vast great prize perhaps, but nobody knew what. And when Valentine came home at lunchtime from another meeting with the Guild of Engineers, Catherine asked him, "Why do they have to send you off on a reconnaissance flight? That's a job for a navigator, not the best archaeologist in the world. It's not fair." Valentine sighed patiently. "The Lord Mayor trusts me, Kate, and I will soon be back. 3 weeks, a month, no more. Now come down to the hangar with me, and we will see what Pusey and Gench have been doing to that airship of mine." In the long millennia since the 60-minute war, airship technology had reached levels that even the ancients had never dreamed of. Valentine had had the 13th floor elevator specially constructed, using some of the money that Crome had paid him for the old tech he found on his trip to America 20 years before. He said she was the finest airship ever built, and Catherine saw no reason to doubt him. Of course, he didn't keep her down at the Tier 5 air harbour with the common merchantmen, but at a private air quay a few hundred yards from Clio House. Catherine and her father walked towards it through the sunlit park. The hangar and the metal apron in front of it were busy with people and bugs, and Pusey and Gench were set about loading the elevator with provisions for the coming flight. Dog went hurrying ahead to sniff at the stacks of crates and drums, tinned meat, lifting gas, medicines, airship puncture repair kits, sun lotion, gas masks, flame-proof suits, guns, rain capes, cold weather coats, map-making equipment, portable stoves, spare socks, plastic cups, 3 inflatable dinghies, and a carton labelled Pink's Patent Outcountry Mud Shoes. Nobody sinks with Pinks. In the shadows of the hangar, the great airship waited, her sleek, black, armoured envelopes screened by tarpaulins. As usual, Catherine felt a rising thrill at the thought of that huge vessel uplifting farther into the sky, and a sadness, too, that he was leaving her, and a fear that he might not return. "Oh, I wish I could go with you," she said. "Not this time, Kate," her father told her. "One day, perhaps." "Is it because I'm a girl?" she asked. "But that doesn't matter. I mean, in ancient times, women were allowed to do all of the same things men did. And anyway, the air trade is full of women pilots. You had one yourself on the American trip. I remember seeing pictures of her." "It's not that, Kate," he said, hugging her. "It's just that it may be dangerous. Anyway, I don't want you to start turning into an old ragamuffin adventurer like me. I want you to stay here and finish school and become a fine, beautiful, high London lady. And most of all, I want you to stop Dog from peeing all over my crates of soup." When Dog had been dragged away and scolded, they sat down together in the shadow of the hangar, and Catherine said, "So will you tell me where you are going? That is so important and dangerous." "I am not supposed to say," said Valentine, glancing down at her out of the corner of his eye. "Oh, come on," she laughed. "We're best friends, aren't we? You know I'd never tell anyone else. And I'm desperate to know where London is going to. Everyone at school keeps asking. We've been travelling east at top speed for days. We didn't even stop when we ate Salt Hook." "Well, Kate," he admitted, "the fact is, Crome has asked me to take a look into Shanguo." Shanguo was the leading nation of the Anti-Traction League, the barbarian alliance which controlled the old Indian subcontinent and what was left of China, protected from hungry cities by a great chain of mountains and swamps that marked the eastern limits of the hunting ground. Catherine had studied it in geography. There was only one pass through those mountains, and it was protected by the dreadful fortress city of Batmunk Gompa. I can't pronounce that. Batmunk Gompa? Batmunk Gompa. The shield wall, beneath whose guns 100 cities had come to grief in the first few centuries of traction. "But why there?" she asked. "London can't be going there." "I didn't say it was," replied Valentine, "but one day we may have to go to Shanguo and breach the League's defences. You know how short prey has become. Cities are starting to starve and turn on one another." Excuse me. Catherine shivered. "There must be some other solution," she protested. "Can't we talk to the Lord Mayors of other cities and work something out?" He laughed gently. "I am afraid municipal Darwinism doesn't work like that, Kate. It's a town-eat-town world. But you mustn't worry. Crome is a great man, and he will find a way. She nodded unhappily. Her father's eyes had that haunted, hunted look again. He had still not confided in her about the girl assassin, and now she could tell that he was keeping something else from her. Something about this expedition and the Lord Mayor's plans for London. Was it all connected somehow? She could not ask him directly about the things she had overheard in the atrium, without admitting that she had spied on him, but just to see what he would say, she asked, "Does this have something to do with that awful girl? Was she from Shanguo?" "No," said Valentine quickly, and she saw the colour drain from his face. "She is dead, Kate, and there is no reason to worry about her any more." The yawning has started. "Come on." He stood up quickly. "We have a few days more together before I set off, so let's make the most of them. We'll sit by the fire and eat buttered toast and talk about old times, and not think about that poor, disfigured girl." As they walked back hand in hand across the park, a shadow slid over them. A Goshawk 90 departing from their engineerium. "You see," said Catherine, "the Guild of Engineers has airships of its own. I think it's horrid of Magnus Crome sending you away from me." But her father just shaded his eyes to watch as the white airship circled top tier and flew quickly towards the west. Dun dun dun! So thirsty. Chapter 8. The Trading Cluster. Tom was dreaming of Catherine. She was walking arm in arm with him through the familiar rooms of the museum. Only there were no curators of guildsmen about, nobody to say, "Polish the floor, Natsworthy," or "Dust the 43rd century glassware." He was showing her around the place as if he owned it, and she was smiling at him as he explained the details of the replica airships and the great cutaway model of London. Though through it all a strange moaning music sounded, and it wasn't until they reached the Natural History Gallery that they realized it was the blue whale singing to them. The dream faded, but the weird notes of the whale's song lingered. He was lying on a quivering wooden deck. Wooden walls rose on either side, with morning sunlight glinting through the gaps between the planks, and overhead a mad confusion of pipes and ducts and tubes crawled over the ceiling. It was Speedwell's plumbing, and its burblings and grumbles were what he had mistaken for the song of the whale. He rolled over and looked around the tiny room. Hester was sitting against the far wall. She nodded when she saw that he was awake. "Where am I?" he groaned. "I didn't know anybody really said that," she said. "I thought that was just in books. Where am I? How interesting." "No, really," Tom protested, looking around at the rough walls and the narrow metal door. "Is this still Speedwell? What happened?" "The food, of course," she replied. "You mean Raylan drugged us? But why?" He got up and made his way to the door across the pitching deck. "Don't bother," Hester warned him. "It's locked." He tried it anyway. She was right. Next, he stumbled over to peer through a crack in the wall. Beyond it, he could see a narrow wooden walkway that flickered like a goggle screen picture as the shadow of one of Speedwell's wheels flashed across it. The out-country was rushing past, looking much rockier and steeper than when last he saw it. "We've been heading south by southeast since first light," explained Hester wearily, before he could ask. "Probably longer, but I was asleep too." "Where are they taking us?" "How should I know?" Tom sat down in a heap with his back to the shuddering wall. "That's it, then," he said. "London must be hundreds of miles away. I'll never get home now." Hester said nothing. Her face was white, making the scars stand out even more than usual, and blood had soaked into the planking around her injured leg. An hour crawled by, and then another. Sometimes people went hurrying along the walkway outside, their shadows blocking out the skinny shafts of sunlight. The plumbing burbled to itself. At last Tom heard the sound of a padlock being undone. A hatch low down on the door popped open, and a face peered in. "Everybody all right?" it asked. "All right," shouted Tom. "Of course we're not all right." He scrambled towards the door. Rayland was on hands and knees outside, crouching down so he could see through the hatch, which Tom suspected was really a cat flap. Behind him were the booted feet of some of his men standing guard. "What have you done this for?" Tom asked. "We haven't done you any harm." The old mare looked embarrassed. "That's true, dear boy, but times are hard, you see. Cruel hard these days. No fun running a traction town. We have to take what we can get. So we took you. We're going to sell you as slaves, you see. That's how it is. There'll be some slaving towns at the cluster, and we're going to sell you. It has to be done. We need spare parts for our engines if we're to keep a step ahead of the bigger towns." Sell us? Tom had heard of cities that used slaves to work in their engine rooms, but it had always seemed like something distant and exotic that would never affect him. "I've got to catch London. You can't sell me." "Oh, I'm sure you'll fetch a good price," Rayland said, as if it were something Tom should be pleased about. "A handsome, healthy lad like you. We'll make sure you go to a good owner. I don't know about your friend, of course. She looks half dead, and she was no oil painting to start with. But maybe we can sell you off together. Buy one, get one free sort of thing." He pushed 2 bowls through the flap, round metal bowls, such as a dog would eat from. One contained water, the other more of the bluish algae. "Eat up," he said cheerfully. "We want you looking nice and well fed for the auction. We'll be at the cluster by sundown and sell you in the morning." "But," Tom protested. "Yes, I know, and I'm terribly sorry about it. But what can I do?" said Rayland sadly. "Times are hard, you know." The hatch slammed shut. "What about my CD?" shouted Tom. There was no answer. He heard Rayland's voice in the passage outside, talking to the guard. Then nothing. He cupped his hands and drank some water, then took the bowl across to Hester. "We've got to get away," he told her. "How?" Tom looked around their cell. The door was no use, locked and guarded as it was. He peered up at the plumbing until he had a crick in his neck. But although some of the pipes looked big enough for a person to crawl through, he could see no way to get into them, or even to reach them. Anyway, he wouldn't have fancied crawling through whatever that thick fluid was, which he could hear gurgling inside them. He turned his attention to the wall, feeling his way along the planks. At last he found one that felt slightly loose, and gradually, as he worked at it, it started to get looser still. It was slow, hard, painful work. Tom's fingers filled with splinters, and the sweat ran down his face, and he had to stop each time someone passed along the walkway outside. Hester watched silently until he started to feel cross with her for not helping. But by evening, as the sky outside turned red and the racing townlet started to slow, he had made a gap just wide enough to get his head through. He waited until he was sure there was no one about, then leaned out. Speedwell was passing through the shadows of some tall spines of rock, the town-gnawed cores of old mountains. Ahead lay a natural Ahead lay a natural shallow bowl between more rock spires, and it was full of towns. Tom had never seen so many trading suburbs and traction villages gathered in one place before. "We're here," he told Hester. "It's the trading cluster." Speedwell slowed and slowed, manoeuvring into a space between a ragged little sail-powered village and a larger market town. Tom could hear the people on the new towns hailing Speedwell, asking where it had come from and what it had to trade. "Scrap metal," he heard Mrs. Rayland bellow back, "and some wood, and a pretty CD, and 2 fine, fresh, healthy young slaves." "Oh, Quirk," muttered Tom, working away at the enlarged hole he had made. "It'll never be big enough," said Hester, who always expected the worst, and was usually right. "You could try helping instead of just sitting there," Tom snapped back, but he regretted it at once, for he could see that she was very ill. He wondered what would happen if she was too weak to escape. He couldn't run off into the out-country alone and leave her here, but if he stayed, he would end up as a slave on one of those filthy little towns. He tried not to think about it and concentrated on making the hole bigger, while the sky outside grew dark and the moon rose. He could hear music and laughter drifting across the trading cluster and the sounds of gangways being run out as some of Rayland's people went off to enjoy themselves aboard the other towns. He scrabbled and scratched at the hole, prizing at the planks, scraping away at them with a rusty nail. But it was no use. At last, desperate, he turned to Hester and hissed, "Please, help." The girl stood up unsteadily and walked over to where he crouched. She looked sick, but not quite as bad as he'd feared. Perhaps she had been saving herself, harbouring her last reserves of strength until it was dark enough to escape. She felt around the edges of the hole he had made and nodded. Then, leaning all her weight on Tom's shoulder, she swung her good foot up hard against the wall. Once, twice she kicked it, the wood around the hole splintering and yielding, and at the third kick a whole section of planking fell out, spilling across the walkway outside. "I could have done that," said Tom, staring at the ragged hole and wondering why he hadn't thought of it. "But you didn't, did you?" said Hester, and tried to smile. It was the first time he had seen her smile, an ugly, crooked thing, but very welcome. It made him feel that she was starting to like him, and didn't just regard him as an annoyance. "Come on then," she said, "if you're coming." Hundreds of miles away across the moonlit mud, Shrike spots something. He signals to the engineer pilots, who nod and grumble as they steer the Goshawk 90 down to land. What now? How much longer are we going to keep flying back and forth along these track marks before he'll admit the kids are dead? But they grumble quietly. They are terrified of Shrike. The hatch opens and Shrike stalks out, his green eyes sweeping from side to side till he finds what he is looking for. A rag of white fabric from a torn shirt, soggy with rain, half buried in the mud. "Hester Shaw was here," he tells the out-country at large, and begins sniffing for her scent. Hey, Maz. Hi, Quillian. You guys having fun? Alright, Chapter 9, The Jenny Hanover. At first, it looked as if their luck might hold. They scrambled quickly across the dimly lit walkway and down into the shadows under one of Speedwell's wheel arches. They could see the dark bulks of the other towns with lights burning in their windows and a big bonfire on the top deck of one of them. A mining townlet on the far side of the cluster where a noisy party was in progress. They crept along the outside of Speedwell to a place where a gangplank stretched across to the market town, which was parked next door. It was unguarded but brightly lit, and as they reached the far end and stepped onto the deck of the market town, "Hey!" Oh, sorry, I missed a whole section. stepped onto the deck of the market town, a voice somewhere behind them shouted, "Hey!" And then louder, "Hey, Uncle Rayland, them slaves are escaping." They ran, or rather Tom ran, and dragged Hester along beside him. Hearing her whimper in pain at every step. Up a stairway, along a catwalk, past a shrine to Peripatetia, goddess of wandering towns, and they were in a market square lined with big iron cages, in some of which thin, miserable slaves were waiting to be sold off. Tom forced himself to slow down and tried to look inconspicuous, listening all the time for sounds of pursuit. There were none. Maybe the Raylands had given up the chase. Or maybe they weren't allowed to chase people onto other towns. Tom didn't know what the rules were in a trading cluster. "Head for the bows," said Hester, letting go of his arm and pulling the collar of her coat up to hide her face. "If we're lucky, there'll be an air harbour at the bows." They were lucky. At the front of the town's top deck was a raised section where half a dozen small airships were tethered, their dark, gas-filled envelopes like sleeping whales. "Are we going to steal one?" Tom whispered. "Not unless you know how to fly an airship," said Hester. "There's an airman's cafe over there. We'll have to try and book passage like normal people." The cafe was just an ancient, rusting airship gondola that had been bolted to the deck. A few metal tables stood in front beneath a stripy awning. Hurricane lamps were burning there, and an old aviator slumped snoring in a chair. The only other customer was a sinister-looking Oriental woman in a long red leather coat who sat in the shadows near the bar. In spite of the dark, she wore sunglasses, the tiny lenses black as the wing cases of beetles. She turned to stare at Tom as he walked up to the counter. A small man with a huge, drooping moustache was polishing glasses. He glanced up without much interest when Tom said, "I'm looking for a ship." "Where to?" "London," said Tom. "Me and my friend have to get back to London, and we have to leave tonight." "London, is it?" The man's mustachios twitched like the tails of two squirrels, which had been shoved up his nose and were starting to get a bit restless. "Only ships with a license from the London Merchants Guild can dock there. We've got nothing like that here. Staines ain't that sort of town." "Staines ain't that sort of town." "Perhaps I may be of help," suggested a soft, foreign-sounding voice at Tom's shoulder. The woman in the red coat had come silently to his side, a lean, handsome woman with badgery slashes of white in her short black hair. Reflections of the hurricane lamps danced in her sunglasses, and when she smiled, Tom noticed that her teeth were stained red. "I haven't a license for London, but I'm going to Airhaven. You could find a ship there that will take you the rest of the way. Have you some money?" Tom hadn't thought about that part. He rummaged in his tunic and fished out 2 tatty banknotes with the face of Quirk on the front, and Magnus Crome gazing sternly from the back. He had put them in his pocket the night he fell out of London, hoping to spend them at the catch party in Kensington Gardens. Here, under the fizzing hurricane lamps of the air harbour, they looked out of place, like toy money. The woman seemed to think so too. "Ah," she said, 20 quirks. But notes like that can only be spent in London. Not much use to a poor wandering skyfarer like me. Don't you have any gold? Or old tech?" Tom shrugged and mumbled something. Out of the corner of his eye he saw newcomers pushing their way between the tables. "Look, Uncle Rayland," he heard one of them shout. "Here they are, we've got them." Tom looked round and saw Rayland and a couple of his boys closing in, carrying heavy clubs. He grabbed Hester, who was leaning against the counter, barely conscious. One of the Speedwell men moved to cut off their escape, but the woman in the red coat barred his way, and Tom heard her say, "These are my passengers. I was just arranging a fee." "They're our slaves," shouted Rayland, pushing past her. "Tom Knitsworthy and his friend. Found 'em in the old country, fair and square. Finders keepers." Tom hurried Hester across the metal deck, past stairways leading up to the quays where the airships moored. He could hear Rayland's men splitting up, shouting to each other as they searched, then a grunt and a crash as if one of them had fallen over. Good, he thought, but he knew that the others would soon find him. He dragged Hester up a short iron stairway to the quays. There were lights in some of the ships that hung at anchor there, and he had a vague idea about forcing his way aboard one of them and making them take him to London. But he had nothing that would serve as a weapon, and before he could look for one, there were feet ringing on the ladder behind him, and Rayland's voice saying, "Please try and be reasonable, Mr. Knitsworthy. I don't want to have to hurt you." "Fred," he added, "I've got the rotters cornered." "Fred?" Tom felt the hope drain out of him. There was no escape now. He stood there meekly as Rayland stepped forward into the light from the portholes of a nearby airship, hefting his club. Hester slumped against a dockside winch and moaned. "It's only fair," said Rayland, as if he thought she was complaining. "I don't like this slaving mucklark any more than you do, but times are hard, and we did catch you. There's no denying it." Suddenly, faster than Tom would have thought possible, Hester moved. She dragged a metal lever out of the winch and swung it at Rayland. His club went whirling out of his hand and hit the deck with glockenspiel sound, and the metal bar struck him with a glancing blow to the side of his head. He wailed, crumping to the floor. Hester lurched forward and raised the bar again, but before she could bring it down on the old man's skull, Tom grabbed her. Tom grabbed her arm. "Stop! You'll kill him." So she swung towards him, snaggle teeth bared, looking like a demented monkey. "So?" "He's right, my dear," said a gentle voice. "There is no need to finish him." Out of the shadows stepped the woman from the bar, her red coat swirling around her ankles as she walked towards them. "I think we should get aboard my ship before the rest of his people come looking for you." "You said we didn't have enough money," Tom reminded her. "You don't, Mr. Knitsworthy," said the aviatrix. "But I can hardly stand by and watch you taken away to be sold as slaves, can I? I was a slave myself once, and I wouldn't recommend it." She had taken off her glasses. Her eyes were dark and almond-shaped, and fine webs of laughter lines crinkled at their corners when she smiled. "Besides," she added, "you intrigue me. Why is a Londoner wandering about in the hunting ground, getting into trouble?" She held out her hand to Tom, a long brown hand with the thin machinery of bones and tendons clearly visible, sliding under papery skin. How do we know you won't betray us like Raylan did? He demanded. You don't, of course, she laughed. You will just have to trust me. After Valentine and the Raylans, Tom didn't think he would ever be able to trust anybody again, but this strange foreigner was the only hope he had. All right, he said, but Rayland got my name wrong. It's Natsworthy. And mine is Fang, said the woman. Miss Anna Fang. She still had her hand outstretched, as if he was a scared animal she wanted to tame. And she was still smiling her alarming red smile. My ship is on Air Quay 6. So they went with her, and somewhere in the oily shadows under the quays, they stepped over Raylan's companions, who lay slumped against a stanchion with their heads lolling drunkenly. Are they? Whispered Tom. Out cold? Said Miss Fang. I'm afraid I just don't know my own strength. Tom wanted to stop and check that the men were all right, but she led him quickly past and up a ladder to Quay 6. The ship that hung at anchor there was not the elegant sky clipper Tom had been expecting. In fact, it was little more than a shabby scarlet gas bag and a cluster of rusty engine pods bolted to a wooden gondola. It's made of junk, he gasped. Junk, laughed Miss Fang. Why, the Jenny Hanover is built from bits of the finest airships that ever flew. An envelope of silicone silk from the Shangguo clipper, that's in French and I cannot read it. Twin aero engines of a Paris gunship, the reinforced gas cells of a Spitsbergen war balloon. It's amazing what you can find in the scrapyards. She led them up the gangplank into the cramped, spice-smelling gondola. It was just a narrow wooden tube with a flight deck at the front, and Miss Fang's quarters at the stern, a jumble of other little cabins in between. Tom had to keep ducking to avoid braining himself on overhead lockers and dangerous-looking bundles of cables that hung from instrument panels on the roof. But the aviatrix flitted about, mumbling in some strange foreign tongue as she set switches, pulled levers, and lit dim green electrics which filled the cabin with an aquarium glow. She laughed when she saw Tom's worried look. That is Esperanto, the common language of the sky. It's a lonely life on the bird roads, and I have a habit of talking to myself. She pulled on a final lever, and the creak and sigh of gas valves echoed through the gondola. There was a clang as the magnetic docking clamps released, and the radio crackled into life and snapped. Jenny Hanover, this is the Staines Harbour Board. You are not cleared for departure. But the Jenny Hanover was departing anyway. Tom felt his stomach turn over as she lifted into the midnight sky. He scrambled to the porthole and saw the market town falling away below. Then Speedwell came into view, and soon the whole cluster was spread out below him like a display of model towns in the museum. Jenny Hanover, insisted the loudspeaker, return to your berth at once. We have a request from the Speedwell Town Council that you give up your passengers, or they will be forced to... Boring, trilled Miss Fang. I'm going to call her Mrs. Fang for the rest of her life. Boring, trilled Miss Fang, flicking the radio off. A homemade rocket battery on the roof of Speedwell Town spat a fizzing flock of missiles after them. 3 hissed harmlessly past. A 4th exploded off the starboard quarter, making the gondola swing like a pendulum. And the 5th came even closer. Anna Fang raised an eyebrow at that one, while Tom and Hester ducked for cover like frightened rabbits. Then they were out of range. The Jenny Hanover was climbing into the cold, clear spaces of the night, and the trading cluster was just a distant smear of light beneath the clouds. Chapter 10. It rained that night on London. Sorry, chapter 10, the 13th floor elevator. It rained that night on London, but by first light the sky was clear and pale as still water, and the smoke from the city's engines rose straight up into the windless air. Wet decks shone silver in the sunrise, and the banners of Tier 1 hung limp and still against their flagpoles. It was a fine spring morning, the morning that Valentine had been hoping for, and Catherine had been dreading. It was perfect flying weather. Although it was so early, crowds had gathered all along the edge. Although it was so early, crowds had gathered all along the edge of Tier 1 to watch the 13th floor elevator lift off. As Gench drove Catherine and her father over to the airquay, she saw that Circle Park was crowded too. It looked as if the whole of High London had come to cheer Valentine on his way. None of them knew where he was going, of course, but as London sped eastward, the city's rumour mills had been grinding night and day. Everyone was sure that Valentine's expedition was connected with some huge prize that the Lord Mayor had hoped to catch out in the central hunting ground. Temporary stands had been erected for the council and guilds, and, when she and Dog had wished father goodbye in the bustling shadows of the hangar, Catherine went to take her place with the historians. Squeezed between Chudley Pomeroy and Dr. Arkengarth, all around her stood the great and good of London, the sober black robes of Father's Guild and the purple of the Guild of Merchants, sombre navigators in their neat green tunics, and a row of engineers robed and hooded in white rubber, looking like novelty erasers. Even Magnus Crome had risen to the occasion, and the Lord Mayor's ancient chain of office hung, gleaming around his thin neck. Catherine wished they had all just stayed at home. It was difficult saying goodbye to someone when you were part of a great cheering mob, all waving flags and blowing kisses. She stroked Dog's knobbly head and told him, "Look, there's Father going up the gangplank now. They'll start the engines in a moment." "I just hope nothing goes wrong," muttered Dr. Arkengarth. "One hears stories about these airships suddenly going off-bang for no reason." "Perhaps we should stand a little further back," suggested Miss Plym, the museum's twittery curator of furniture. "Nonsense," Catherine told them crossly. "Nothing is going to go wrong." "Yes, do shut up, Arkengarth, you silly old coot," agreed Chudley Pomeroy, surprising her. "Never fear, Miss Valentine. Your father has the finest airship and the best pilots in the world. Nothing can go wrong." Catherine smiled gratefully at him, but she kept her fingers crossed just the same, and Dog caught something of her mood and started to whimper softly. From inside the hangar came the sound of hatches slamming shut and the rattle of boarding ladders being dragged clear. An expectant hush fell over the stands. Along the tier's edge, High London held its breath. Then, as the band struck up Rule Londonium, Valentine's ground crew began dragging the 13th floor elevator out into the sunlight. A sleek black dart whose armoured envelope shone like silk. On the open platform at the stern of the control gondola, Valentine stood waving. He saluted the ground crew and the flag-decked stands, and then smiled straight at Catherine, picking her face out of all the others without a moment's hesitation. She waved back frantically, and the crowd cheered themselves hoarse as the 13th floor elevator's engine pods swiveled into take-off position. The ground crew cast off the mooring hawsers. The propellers began to turn, and blizzards of confetti eddied in the downdrafts as the huge machine lifted into the air. Some apprentice historians spread out a banner reading Happy Valentine's Day, and the cheers went on, as if the crowds thought it was their love alone which was keeping the explorer airborne. But Valentine took no notice of the noise or the flags. He stood watching Catherine, one hand raised in farewell, until the airship was so high and far away that she could not make him out any more. At last, when the elevator was just a speck in the eastern sky and the stands were emptying, she wiped away her tears and took dog's lead and turned to go home. She was already missing her father, but she had a plan now. While he was away, she would make her own inquiries and find out who that mysterious girl had been and why she scared him so. Ten chapters today isn't so bad. Hey you guys, time to wake up. That's gonna be it for tonight, you guys. Hi. Did you guys like that? Are we happy we brought story time back? Felt a little bit weird then saying, yeah, you like that? Great, see? Nothing to worry about. I just fumbled over my words a little bit, that's all. I'm going to send you over to Trashy. She's playing Supermarket Simulator. And I don't have anything planned for tomorrow. Sundays, every Sunday now, sausage. So make sure you 9 a.m. my time. Thank you for the follow, Brooks. Go and say hello to Trashy for me. We can talk about story time in our chat and stuff like that, and we will continue off on Sunday next week. Thank you, sausage. Already over? I don't want to do too much at once. I'll ease back into the long streams. I love you guys so much. You guys are the best. I really do. Hope you have a wonderful day or night or whatever it is you're up to.